This painting here begins with a simple sketch and an acrylic underpainting. So the first thing I did once I had the sketch that I liked is I washed on a color of brown basically over the bighorn sheep which I'm painting, and then I just proceeded with the sky, the background, and then moved to the foreground, all with about a 1-inch flat brush, just scrubbing on the colors that are most prominent in each area. And really it's more of a wash of color, very transparent layer, just to almost tone the canvas. I kind of consider this, as I say a lot of times, an active toning phase where it's kind of a blocking in phase as well as just making sure I get all of those washes of color toned onto the canvas. And throughout this blocking in phase, I used a smaller filbert brush and a couple other smaller brushes just to start to give the appearance of some of the detail on. I'm using acrylics right now, and so I don't want to go into extreme detail. I do paint oils over the top in just a minute here, but I want to establish the colors, I want to establish the contrast, the values, and I want to get a real clear idea in my head of where I'm moving with this painting. I did try a couple things. You can see me add a larger tree to the left, which I quickly decided against. I think sometimes people can get confused with how much paint I'm actually using in this portion of the painting. I use golden fluid acrylics and Liquitex soft body so that the paint layers are very thin, and I also dilute them down with some water and glazing medium. So each layer that's going on right now is so thin that it doesn't actually create any buildup on the canvas, and things like this large tree that I add are actually really easy to erase with another simple layer of paint. It doesn't actually create any ridges or buildup whatsoever. And even if I change a painting several times, I end up with a paint layer that's still almost micro thin. So let's just go ahead and stop the video right here for a second and talk about how I got to this point. The composition is comprised of several different areas that I had visited over the past month or so. The background was from several photos I had taken at a location, as well as that big rock structure, that rock cliff on the right hand side. I actually grabbed out of a photo. It was quite small in the photo. You can see it far back there, down off to the right. And I just really liked the look of this cliff. I liked the composition of it, the snow, the outcroppings of it. And so I just kind of took that inspiration and drew up something that was a lot larger than my reference photo, but I thought it fit very nicely. The bighorn rams were also using reference and video that I had taken, and the exception is the one on the right. I sort of used my imagination to increase the size of his horns. I wanted him to be a older, more mature ram, and so I kind of went back and forth trying to figure out how to really make those horns a lot bigger. And then the lower foreground was using reference from one of the photos I had taken while out photographing the bighorns. So that's sort of how I pieced this whole composition together, how I got what I wanted. And then from here, I just kind of went right into the oil paints and began to bring it to life. So I tried to do this by working from back to front, starting with the sky, and I did a pretty simple wash of color over the sky to begin with, and then just dove right in to the mountains. And to do these distant mountains, I used a combination of a small round brush and a small liner brush. And I tried to add a lot of detail without overdoing it and distracting the viewer. So I use a lot of subtle color variations. You can see a hint of highlights as well as a hint of shadows throughout. But I tried to keep it fairly minimal, just enough where you could notice with your eye. Now I said back to front, but because that rock cliff was so large and so high up into the sky, I kind of tried to bring that down together at the same time. And so the way that I started with this rock is just tried to model in the shadows and highlights. I tried to get the values correct and the composition correct. So I used a filbert brush and, well, actually two different sizes of filbert brushes, and I tried to focus on the shadowing and the highlights. Tried to avoid the detail, but I wanted to create, the sense of three-dimensionality with that. So once that modeling portion was done and dried, I went back over the top, wet over dry, and I started with a round brush, the same round brush that I'm using for the trees, and I started to add the shadows and the highlights. So you can see me going from dark to light. Now, a lot of this rock is in the shadows itself, but I wanted to create, essentially shadows within those shadows. So there really was no shortcut for me on the rock. I did not use like a sponge palette knife. I experimented with a little bit of palette knife at some point, but for the most part, it was all done with this round brush. And the way that I did that was just focus on the shadows, trying to get them in the correct spot, and then add a little bit of texture, some highlights over the top of those shadows to create that realistic feel. And so it was really just, again, back and forth from the highlights and shadows in the rocks, and then of course a little bit of snow trickling down those rocks as well to kind of give it that finishing feel. Here you can see me testing out the palette knife, and I really went back over the top with my round brush after that and kind of erased what I did with that palette knife because I just wasn't feeling it. I try to experiment a lot of times with different ways of painting rocks, and I'm going to talk about that in a future video here shortly. But rocks are something that I'm still learning myself and still trying to figure out myself, and so I don't have really a defined way or a consistent way that I always do them. So I feel like this was sort of one of those things again where, although I was really happy with how it all came together, it was a lot of testing and trial and error for me at this point. I really just tried to detail tree by tree as I started to get closer to the foreground. So in this portion of the trees, I tried to add a little bit more detail than what was far back in the distance. I wanted to catch the viewer's eyes with these brighter yellow trees to the left, sort of indicating the idea of some sunlight striking the tops of those, but I wanted to keep them subtle. So a little bit of detail, a little bit more detail, but not enough where it was overpowering. Once I had some of those golden highlights on the trees, I started to break up this whole forest with the idea of some of the snow showing through so we could see through the trees to the forest floor. And it was really just a lot of back and forth from the trees to the snow, just trying to sharpen up the idea of, each individual tree. And then I went right to the floor of the valley where there is a lot of willows, brush, maybe a small creek, and then I added a few smaller trees. So once that valley in the back was completed, I went right into the trees. And I started with the highlights on the trees. I used some brighter yellow, sort of a yellowish green at first, but I ended up kind of switching to more of an orange color. And the way I did these trees was much of the same way that I'm doing the whole painting from back to front. Here you can see me start to add a little bit of that orange over the top when I wasn't happy with sort of that yellowish look. And basically I just tried to paint the shape of the tree, and then I added the highlights and then the shadows in front of that. And it seemed to work out pretty well. I used the round brush, the small round brush that I'm using, and really just sort of speckled on the little pine bough textures throughout, and I was very pleased. So as I'm kind of moving towards the bighorns, getting closer to the foreground, I tried to clean up some of the areas around the sheep right behind them, and then I just dove right into modeling the sheep's bodies. And I think pretty much throughout the rest of this painting I'm going to be using this round brush here. I think it was, I'll have the link in the description below of which brush that is. I think it's number 6 or 2 or something like that. But I painted these sheep in the same way that I did the other bighorn in my previous video. Just a lot of it is essentially the same way that I painted that rock behind the sheep. So I just kind of focused on the shadows and the highlights, and I went back and forth trying to manipulate the paint on the canvas. A lot of the sheep were painted wet and manipulating those textures until I was pleased with them. I did let it dry after the first layer, and I went back and added some brighter highlights and some darker shadows, but the majority of them were painted wet. I think I do this because when I paint wet over dry, sometimes, especially for things like fur on animals, it can look a little bit rough. So I feel like that I get a better result when painted wet, kind of a smoother look to them, at least for the first layer, like I said. I can add some glazes over the top, some highlight, some sheens of color. But I like a base that was painted wet and wet just because it does give me that buttery look, which is great for fur. Not so much the horns, but especially the bodies. I think at this point, as I'm working on this larger ram, I am doing wet over dry as I paint those darker shadows. So you can see me bouncing around, really starting to add some of the creases and darker gaps into the fur. So once those rams were about 90% completed, I jumped right into the foreground. And the first portion of this, I'm painting wet and wet, just blocking in essentially. And once I was satisfied with where everything was, the bushes, the grass, I let it dry and then I went over the top. And about right here, I started to paint wet over dry. And I jumped to that smaller round brush again to start to add some of those details. From here on out, it's pretty much just speckling on grass texture, bush texture. I did go back to a few different areas throughout the painting. I still feel at this point that I'm still going back and revisiting the painting from time to time. All in all, I couldn't tell you how many hours I have into this. I think there were maybe 60 to 70 hours of actual brush work, but that doesn't include the 60 to 70 hours of color mixing, the 50 hours of planning. There's a lot of things that go into this, probably 200 to 300 hours all said and done, but the finished result was something that I couldn't be happier with. I really wanted to honor and show my appreciation for the Bighorn sheep with this painting, and so I really hope that I accomplished that, and I hope you guys enjoy this piece as well. Thanks for watching.